Hey! In this video, I'll be talking about the books I read in the month of February. I read a total of 4 books, with 2 books being 3 stars and 1 being 4 stars, and 1 book being 1 star. The categories of fiction were fantasy and contemporary fiction, so let's get straight into it. So the first book I want to start with is The DNF, which was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, where 2 friends, often in love but never lovers, come together as creative partners in the world of video game design, where success brings them fame, joy, tragedy, duplicity, and ultimately a kind of immortality. Spanning 30 years from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Venice Beach, California, and lands in between and far beyond, Gabrielle Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is a dazzling and intricately imagined novel that examines the multifarious nature of identity, disability, failure, the redemptive possibilities in play, and above all, our need to connect, to be loved and to love. Yes, it is a love story, but it is not one you have read before. I didn't find too many issues with the story in the first and only 40 pages I read it, and there was actually an interesting moment in regards to the game made by one of the main characters, providing a curious insight into the way people viewed gaming and themselves as the gamer. But I think I was just not vibing with the book, or more specifically the author at the moment. Considering I've already bought the book, it could be in the cards to read it again sometime in the distant future, especially since there's going to be a movie made on it. But right now I have no interest in picking this one up again, and I'm more interested in other books at the moment. Now let's move on to the first book I read in the month of February, which was book 1 of the War of Lost Hearts trilogy titled Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. We are following Tisana, who is ripped away from her homeland as a child, having to buy her freedom from her captor and finally escaping. Desperate to save the best friend she left behind, Tisana journeys to the Orders, the most powerful organizations of magic wielders in the world. But to join their ranks, she must complete an apprenticeship with Maxentarius Falione, a handsome and reclusive fire wielder who despises the Orders. The Orders' intentions are cryptic, and Tisana must prove herself under the threat of looming war, but even more dangerous are her growing feelings for Maxentarius. The bloody past he wants to forget may be the key to her future, or the downfall of them both. This book seemed to have promise in the beginning, and I actually stopped at page 400 with 80 pages left, so I didn't consider it a complete DNF since I devoted enough time to consider it read. Regardless though, the main reason why I stopped and didn't continue the series is because I just simply became uninterested. Let me explain. There were points that held my attention, and there was a rhythm to it, and even though the rhythm was low at times, I was still enjoying the book. But it started to drag about halfway into the book, probably when part 2 came along. Then Max's point of view came through, and it dragged the story more. Then there were dream sequences, and though informative, mostly dragged. Then there was a travel by ship sequence, and that dragged too. I will say about the dream sequences though that it is a bit hard for me to care about those, since most of the time I feel like authors chuck them in there to fill up space or something. At least that's the impression that it gives me. And in this book, the dream sequences could have been whittled down or written differently. The first half of the book is actually relatively slow too, but I think it serves a purpose to build up the story and the relationship between Tisana and Max, so the slowness didn't bother me that much, and I actually like their characters and their interactions with other people. Later on in the last half of the book, I just couldn't bring myself to care about anything. Then I started watching Ellen Catherine's YouTube video on completing the series, and she was reading the 3rd book, I believe it was, and the way she was describing it made me even more uninterested to continue. Then I started reading the Goodreads reviews, and by this point I was checked out, since I usually don't read reviews until after I've finished a book, and they just made me even more uninterested, and sort of spoke to what Ellen said in her video as well. I looked up how a couple of the characters' stories were justified, and there was one particular character that I was pretty disappointed in learning how their character arc went. It just didn't seem to align with what they did in the first book, and as you can imagine, all of this made me uninterested in continuing the series. It's a shame too, since the covers of these books are stunning, but it's not enough to keep my attention. Honestly, I feel like giving it 3 stars was a bit too generous. It might be a 2 stars. I cared more about Max's flower garden than anything else, and that says a lot. The next book I read in February was Finding Grace by Loretta Rothschild. Unexpectedly, this one happened to be the one saving grace of the entire month, since the other books seemed to be lackluster. To avoid any spoilers, since there are specific plot points in the book that are necessary to remain unspoiled, I'm just going to read the synopsis verbatim, which is virtually what I've been doing for all the books anyway, so here we go. The premise goes as follows. Anna seems to have everything. She adores her daughter Chloe and her husband Tom. even if he does work 100 hours a week. But her longing for another baby threatens to eclipse all of it, until a shocking event changes their lives forever. Years later, Tom makes a decision that ripples through their family's lives in ways he could not have foreseen. As the consequences of that fateful choice unfold, two women's paths become irrevocably intertwined. But when old love clashes with new, who will be left standing? And what happens when your secrets come back to haunt you? I'm glad the synopsis gives away nothing, because this book was a wild story. I enjoyed the moral and ethical dilemma, the reprehensible characters. It was written relatively well, especially when it came to the pacing. I'm honestly surprised I like a book by a Rothschild, but maybe it takes one to know one considering the author is a Rothschild, or married to one, I should say. With all that being said though, it did not deserve that ending. In fact, I was hoping that wasn't the ending it will get. This book was rife with horror undertones, and so to have that be the ending was just... I don't know, I can't describe it in any other way besides it being icky, but it was a good book nonetheless. The next book I read was Blue Sisters by Coco Mellors, where three estranged siblings return to their family home in New York after the beloved sister's death in this unforgettable story of grief, identity, and the complexities of family. But coming home is never easy as it seems. As the sisters reckon with the disappointments of their childhood and the loss of the only person who held them together, they realize the greatest secrets they've been keeping might not have been from each other, but from themselves. And what was this book? I truly need to know what I just read. When I first started my YouTube channel, I uploaded a video dedicated to the best books I read last year, and one of them I mentioned was Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Mellors, and I gave that book 5 stars. Blue Sisters made me reconsider my star rating for Cleopatra and Frankenstein, and made me second guess whether or not I was being way too generous and whether or not that book was as good as I had thought. I'll start with the book being a slog, and right off the bat it starts that way. The writing is mostly good, but does feel stilted in some areas, and a lot of what I'm reading are things that have happened as opposed to what's happening currently. I like the idea of building a foundation by diving into the past, but that's all it did. It was done so horribly. The book begins with a prologue, and it was so unnecessary and seemed to have started the story dragged down. We are introduced to all 4 sisters by way of an omniscient point of view, but the sentiments of the prologue could have been peppered into the following few chapters to make it less weighted. Reason being is that the point of views change between chapters, so the author had leeway to be able to do this, and I'm at a loss as to why she chose to write a prologue as well as reiterate the sentiments of the prologue in the rest of the book. The first 100 pages is just introducing us to the characters of the 3 sisters again, but on a more deeper level. And although I do think it was important to the story to include where they are in life currently as well as some backstory, I think the way it was done felt a little too information overload. We don't necessarily see them live their lives, we are mostly told how they usually or used to live their lives. I also knew nothing about Nikki, which is the sister that died, so it makes me not invested enough. I end up thinking, so what? My favourite characters were Chitty and Riley, and if you knew how little Riley appeared in the book, you'd understand how much I disliked the book. I skimmed the last 80 pages to avoid a DNFing for the 3rd time in February. This is what I consider the 2-book deal curse. I can almost guarantee this was part of a 2-book deal in favour of the author's debut, which I enjoyed greatly, but alas, her second was a complete letdown. The last book I read in the month of February was Even If These Tears Disappear Tonight by Misaki Ichijo, translated from the Japanese by Winifred Bird, where college student Toru Naruse falls in love with his upperclassman Izumi Wataya, and she accepts his confession on the condition that he cannot fall in love with her. Their fake relationship begins, but Toru soon discovers that Izumi can't forget her love from high school. Hoping to learn who that person was, he seeks out her best friend, Maori Hino. We follow characters from Even If This Love Disappears Tonight in this sequel about another heart-wrenching tale of first love. This is another instance of reading the author's debut novel, absolutely loving it, but being let down by their second. The first book was so touching and tender and seemed to have a heart and depth that was missing from this book, and it left me feeling dissatisfied by the story progression. This book was like 80 to 90% either rehash of the first book or repetitive in of itself, and I didn't connect to the characters as much as I did with the first one. The whole thing just felt like a cheap ploy to replicate the emotional pull of the first book. It's hard not to compare this book with its predecessor, especially since this book forces you to recount the entire first book. I just wish this one stood on its own. There were moments that really seemed to drive the story forward, which added a new element to the story, but the plot mostly meandered. The other notable critique I have is the writing style. Now, for both books, it very clearly states it's for the ages 13 and up, so I am aware the writing will be of a certain young caliber, but the first book seemed to carry well with this type of writing with the use of its plot, characters, imagery, etc. On the other hand, because this book was not only lacking in all those departments, but also super repetitive, the writing appeared to be glaringly poor, and instead of carrying the flow of the story, it seemed to drag it down. It was a lovely story nonetheless, but it's not worth reading. I'll continue to read from this author though, since I enjoy her work. Her other book is called In a World of Lies, I Fell into an Unforgettable Love, which is thankfully not connected to her previous 2 books, otherwise I wouldn't have picked it up. So that was February. Honestly, in regards to reading, the beginning of the year is shaping up to be quite lackluster. I've yet to find a 5-star read, and I feel like a lot of other people are, or at least other people are having better reads to start the year. But hopefully my next few reads will be good. And in fact, I'm currently reading Gifted and Talented by Olivia Blake, and I'm actually enjoying that one so far. I have some thoughts though, but I'll leave it for my next wrap up. I'm also enjoying Girl Set's new song Tweak. I know I've mentioned an album release in my previous video, so I figured I'd mention what I was looking forward to in this month as well. To put it simply, Girl Set is like Cat's Eye, but instead of having their show on Netflix, it was on YouTube. Now, in relation to what I'm thinking of reading after my current read, the next few books I have my eyes on are as follows: The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, The 10-Year Affair by Erin Summers, She's a Lamb by Meredith Hambrock, The Stalker by Paula Boma, and The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Mathilde Samad. I'm also considering picking up a fantasy book, but I haven't decided which one yet. That's all for this video. Take care and bye!